And thank you everyone who's chosen to participate, especially members of the Scions of the 17th Airborne, people descended from members of the 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment. It's really nice to have you there. I think Linda Green deserves a lot of credit for that. In addition, there may be some folks in Britain, I'm not certain about that, possibly Henry Wilson from Pen and Sword. If they are there, I'd just like to say we all wish your Prime Minister a speedy recovery. Today's talk, if nothing, is a celebration of Anglo-American cooperation in difficult times. And we all, of course, are experiencing rather unusual times, but we're going to talk today about 75 years ago when things were kind of unusual also. And the original idea that Mike and I talked about was to do something with regards to what was happening in a given week 75 years ago, and it's kind of expanded into a series, really, to talk about things. So at the end, I'll make a little reference to what happened in early April, but I would like to look back a bit and talk about something that is, if it's not the largest operation that most people don't know about, it's got to be pretty close to it, and that's Operation Varsity. I've talked to people in Britain who really know World War II, and I was surprised to learn that some of them didn't know much about it. So we don't have a lot of shots, just 10 photographs and a few maps to really just give you a flavor of sort of what went on. They've been chosen for specific reasons that we'll talk about when we see them. So as Mike said, if you have questions, please type them in. I think half an hour is probably all of me you can endure. And then after that, we can address some questions if you have any. So with no further ado, Mike, why don't you go ahead and pull up the first slide. Okay, what you see is a sketch map that's based on a map in the World War II Green Book series that shows the operation, the layout. And I'll show you a more general one later that places Wesel in its geographic context. But basically, off to the upper left is the Dutch border in Nijmegen. So we're not very far at all from the Market Garden corridor. And in September 1944, when Market Garden was being discussed, the British Second Army commander, Dempsey, was not in favor of the operation. He was never an enthusiastic supporter. And he thought that an attempted crossing down near Wesel made more sense at that point. The Americans had already, or were in the process of entering Aachen at that point. But we're looking back a little bit. We're now talking about March of 1945, when the Allies had begun to push up to the Rhine at various locations. As early as the 7th of March, the First Army crossed at Remagen down south of Cologne. And a few days before Operation Varsity, Patton slipped troops across the Rhine, and by the 24th had an entire division supported by some armor across further south with his Third Army. But from the start, emphasis had been placed on the northern corridor in Europe, and this was a classic Bernard Montgomery set-piece operation, and with infantry pushing up to the Rhine with massed artillery and the use of airborne troops in what was the largest, the final large operation in World War II, and probably the largest the world will ever see again, given changes in military technology. The plan was to have British infantry divisions, shown as the 51st Highland and 15th Scottish, to the north cross, and 2 American divisions cross south of Wesel. But to jump across the Rhine, they would launch the British 6th Airborne, which had last seen combat in Normandy, because they jumped on the night of D-Day, And the 17th Airborne, the 507th, had also jumped in Normandy with the 82nd, but then was transferred into the 17th Airborne. And but the members of the infantry of the 17th Airborne had fought as infantry in the Ardennes. So they apart from replacements, they were veterans at that point. Mike, the next shot, please. This is a group of probably glider infantry from the 194th on the morning of the 24th of March, which is the D-Day for Operation Varsity, marching to their glider transports. And you just get a sense of the quantity of individuals involved. Next slide, please. Back up. There we go. This is artistically an interesting shot because you can see how early in the morning it is. But it also shows what must be 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment paratroopers boarding a C46 transport. Now, up until this point in the war, the paratroop operations had depended on C47s, or what the British would call Dakotas, to carry 18 paratroopers plus a crew of 4 or 5. They introduced the C46s because they could carry twice as many paratroopers. They could carry a total of 36. And they had opposing doors so they could jump simultaneously, 2 at a time. The problem with the C46 was that unlike a number of the C47, the C46s did not have self-sealing fuel tanks. And as a consequence, flying fairly low, fairly slowly, they were more vulnerable. And there are some images you will see of transports with their wings on fire, because what would tend to happen would be the fuel would leak out of the tank if struck by anti-aircraft fire. It would run down the wings into the engines, which were, of course, very hot with predictable results. Next shot, please, Mike. This is an enlargement of an image that itself is interesting because of who was taking it and where it was being taken from. The reason I'm showing it is you can see the density of parachutes in the air over the drop zones at Operation Varsity. And I think that I go back and forth, but I'm pretty sure these are C46s. It looks like, one of them looks like a C47. It might have gotten mixed in, but they all look like C46s, in which case it would be the 513 jumping. And at least one of the paratroopers that I had the good fortune to interview in 2010, a man named Irv Hennings from Minnesota, talked about the fact that when he jumped out on the morning of the 24th, his parachute did not fully open. And there were so many parachutes in the air, he could kind of rest his feet on one below him and sort of ride on it. He didn't want to put too much weight on it because he didn't want to collapse the guy's chute. He said he still hit the ground pretty hard, but it had been plowed for spring planting. So that softened his blow. I mean, these people were absolutely remarkable when you hear him talk about these things in such a matter-of-fact manner. The other reason this photograph is interesting is it was taken from a B-17 plane that was carrying photographers and journalists. And it's one of the last photographs taken from that plane before it was hit by anti-aircraft fire and the people had to bail out. The photographer was a man named Quant, who jumped with his camera, or at least with his film pack. I assume he was using a 4x5 camera, and rescued the film footage. If some of you are as old as I am, you might remember a Richard C. Hotlett, who used to be a reporter for CBS News in the 1960s. Well, he was on board this plane also, and was forced to bail out at the same time. So, and James Gavin from the 82nd was actually an observer in another bomber, and he talked about the whole scene as being a rather with a great deal of anti-aircraft fire, because it had been a set-piece Montgomery operation, and as a result, the Germans sort of knew it was coming. So they had a lot of anti-aircraft batteries, and there were relatively high losses among the transport aircraft and gliders. Something like 50 in total were destroyed. I'm sorry, 50 of each, so about 100, and over 300 were damaged in some fashion.
Hey, Brooke, could you speak up a little bit?
Sure, Mike. Okay, next slide, please. All right, now this may not look like much of a photograph, but it's here for two reasons. One, it's with the photographer McCleary, who was with the command group, General Miley's command group of the 17th Airborne. And it's described as being the troops being under fire. They're certainly hugging the ground very closely. And one of them is either trying to retrieve a bundle or aid someone who's injured or wounded. The reason it's so foggy and misty is because there was a great deal of smoke that obscured the ground. Now, when the planes arrived on the east side of the Rhine, they at first thought it was possibly intentional fire set by the Germans, smoke shells that had been fired or something. But in fact, what it was to cover the crossing of the infantry that was crossing the Rhine. The Allies laid down a smoke screen, and it blew over the area, and many of the drop zones were missed, or some cases widely. 1st Battalion of the 513th ended up jumping into the British zone, but that proved to be a fortuitous occurrence because their gliders were landing on unsecured zones, unlike Normandy, and to a degree unlike in Market Garden. But the presence of the 513th troopers was credited by a number of British units in helping reduce their casualties. But you can see now, if you know what you're looking for, a lot of the photographs of Varsity show misty, smoky kind of conditions, and that's what it relates to. Okay, Mike, next shot. Now, this is an interesting photograph for a couple of reasons. The people probably don't need any introduction. Certainly the person in the center, that's General Eisenhower. To his left is the British Chief of the Imperial General Staff, General Alenbrook. And the event is the day after Varsity, when there is a picnic that's been laid on in Lindfort on the east bank of the Rhine. Now, this whole thing, because it was so planned, was a spectator event of sorts. With Churchill present, obviously Montgomery, but Alenbrook was there, Eisenhower was there, the commanders of both the American 12th Army Group, Bradley, and the 9th Army, William Simpson, were there. And the relief is obvious in the photograph of the two individuals, the smiles on their faces. Apparently, the menu consisted of chicken, which you can see on Alenbrook's fork, and spirits, which you can see in Ike's glass. Now, the white strip on the right-hand side has been placed by the censor to obscure the table, which is, if you look behind Ike, you can see various glasses and bottles and things, and I suspect it was pretty laden with gin and various other libations. But it's also historically very interesting because the event is described in a number of accounts, including one by Eisenhower and one by Alenbrook, and it's described very differently. In Crusade in Europe, Eisenhower says, during this luncheon, Alenbrook comes up to him and he says, Ike, I now see what you're trying to accomplish, and I completely support your strategy. And when Alenbrook's war diaries were published, about not quite 10 years after Crusade in Europe was published, Alan Brooke expresses surprise at this comment, saying he never remembers saying anything of the sort, and he doubts he would have because he completely disagreed with Eisenhower's strategy. And that remained a sticking point right the way through the campaign. After Normandy, it came to a head at the end of the Ardennes Battle of the Bulge, and in addition, picked up again to a degree once they crossed the Rhine. It's also important to note that for the British, crossing the Rhine historically was really the entrance to Germany. I don't think the Americans made that distinction as much, but Montgomery says in his memoirs that he's with Churchill watching it, and he asked the Prime Minister, when was the last time that British troops fought in Germany? And Churchill immediately, with immediate recall of historical reference, said that it was in 1813 during the Battle of Nations against Napoleon near Leipzig when a British rocket artillery battery had participated in the event. And in the occupation of Germany after the war, it's significant to note that the British occupation army was known as the Army of the Rhine. So, at any rate, Varsity is an event that the veterans of both the British 6th Airborne and the American 17th Airborne came to feel was subsumed within the larger British effort to cross the Rhine. They don't feel as though they have gotten the credit that they deserve. I have to agree with that. One of the people who was an historian, veteran from the 17th Airborne, Bart Hagerman, who appeared in the excellent documentary, The Battle of the Bulge by Tom Lemon, really came to feel that way. He's talking about the Ardennes and that, but he also commented later on Varsity. The Charles McDonald, who wrote the official history for the U.S. Army, certainly praised the troops that participated, but questioned what the need for the operation in the first place. So I would urge you to read about Varsity. There are a few books. When I wrote my account, I went back really to the original documents, the unit histories. And also, if you're interested in the British participation, I would urge you to look at an excellent website called Pegasus Archive, maintained by a man named Mark Hickman. It's really superb and puts a lot of the original documents, the British war diaries and things, on the internet, as well as photographs and other documentary information. Okay, Mike, the next map, please. All right, just to give you a sense of where we're talking about being, at the top of the map, just under Arnhem, you'll see the name Basel, which is the crossing that we've just been discussing. And it's just north of the German industrial district, Ruhr. And it's an important area, and it's been a focus of, in fact, the plan for Market Garden was to cross the final, the lower Rhine at Arnhem and then swing northward, swing eastward and engage in subjugating the Rhine with the assistance of the First Army. Ultimately, that's what they begin to do. So after Market Garden, the troops began to push eastward. The American 9th Army is ultimately released from Montgomery's control back to Bradley's control. And when the First Army from the south, near Cologne, swings up as the 9th Army is swinging south from the Basel area and encircles the Ruhr at that point. And although it took that occurred on the 1st of April, and even though the final subjugation of the Ruhr took about 3 weeks, they captured something in the neighborhood of 300,000 German soldiers there. Meanwhile, Patton is beginning from the Frankfurt area and the Saar area to push, having crossed at Oppenheim and other places, push eastward. And while some of his troops swing north to Cassel. And then the Ninth Army, while they're leaving some troops behind to work with First Army, also tears forward and begins to reach the Elbe, does so on the 11th of April at Magdeburg, which you can see on the map. The British are driving across the North German plain, up ultimately towards Hamburg. And the day being the 7th, that in, if you'll notice, just south of, to the west of Leipzig, you'll see Ohrdruf. That's the first concentration camp that the Western Allies encounter. We're not going to talk about that today. If we do another one of these, we'll focus on events that happened in mid-April.
Brooke, you got to move closer to your mic.
I want to show you a few more slides of operations at the very end. Here's a group associated with the 17th Airborne, the 54th Signal Battalion, that's evidently sheltering in a ditch because of a mortar attack. The excellent view of the soldiers themselves, and they're on the east side of the Rhine at this point. Okay, another slide. And the in this instance, and it's taken about the 29th of March, the Haystack has been set on fire because they believe snipers were inside, and they used tracers to try to drive them out, and coincidentally set the Haystack ablaze. Okay, and the final slide, if you would. This is the 513th entering the rather devastated town of Munster, which is just north of the Ruhr, on the 29th of March, the 30th of March. They're doing so in concert with the British 6th Armored Brigade. This was not a part of the Guards Armored Division, but it had the same sorts of armored troops, Coldstream Guards, Grenadier Guards, and Scots Guards in this case. And the man, Irv Hennings, I referred to earlier, who jumped from the plane, remembered the British in interesting ways. He said, they rode the tanks because the British 6th Armored Brigade did not have its infantry of its own, so they used the 513th. And he said they took the war in an interesting fashion. He said every afternoon at 4 o'clock, they would stop and tea. Sometime in the afternoon, tea would be presented, which is perhaps a terrible stereotype, but that was Irv's comment. But he also said that he was very impressed by the British troops, particularly the officers, because he said if you asked an American officer something, it is an officer not say, well, I don't know, or I can't tell you. But he said you asked a British officer a question about this, he would look you in the eye and he would give you an answer. And Irv found this to be very, very impressive. And I'd just like to reach back and tell one more story about Varsity. It's from a man who was not a member of the 513th. He was in the 517th Signal Company. His name was John Corman. And he had an illustrious career later in the State Department. But at this point, he arrives on a glider, which crash landed, and is moving forward, and they're passing a small collection of houses. Now, John Corman's parents were German, and he grew up in New York State, but he spoke German fluently. So as he was passing one of these houses, he heard a noise come from a cellar door. So he stood there, pulled the door open, pulled a pin from a grenade, and held the handle. And he called out in German to, come and see here quickly, and nothing happened. So he contemplated throwing the grenade, but he had received from his mother a letter just before Varsity took off. And in it, she said, being German, she said, please remember that the soldier you'll be opposing is someone who has a family, and if you have a chance to show mercy, please do. So whether this thought was in his head or not, he could never entirely remember, but he said he did call out again, and when the people came up from the cellar, it was about a dozen women, children, and older men, who then helped him find the pin to put back in the grenade. And he said that he was always grateful for what he called his mother's mercy, because it saved their lives and spared him a lifetime of regret. Thank you for your time here. I hope you found it of some interest. It's a very good series that Mike has organized. I think he's going to have Joe Galloway later in the month and some other people, some Medal of Honor winners speaking. So I would urge you to tune in again. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to try to address them. There is a reading list available that Mike can post for you if you want to download it. It's 2 pages, sort of annotated. It's by no means exhaustive, but it's things that I found helpful and of interest. So, Mike, do you have any questions?
Anybody have questions? Right now, there are no questions, Brooke.
Okay.
What I would just ask is, this was the first of the series, and I just ask if you could provide some feedback. My email is mperry@armyheritage.org. If you want to shoot us a note, we will work to improve what you thought needs improving and sustain what we think needs to be sustained. But I do thank you for participating, and I will shoot you a listing of books that or readings that Brooks recommends. Any other comments from the group? Oh, we got one here. Question really is, how long did the war last and what year? This is anonymous attendee asking how much longer did the war last?
It's only about 6 weeks in Europe. This is the 24th of March to first week in April. The war ended formally on at midnight on the 8th, 9th of June. So some people consider the VE Day to be the 8th. Some people consider it to be the 9th. The actual surrender document was signed in early morning of the 7th of May. But of course, it went on in Europe till the formal surrender documents there weren't signed until early September. And I would point out, in addition, I should have mentioned this as a start, this is also the week when the final battle, major battle in the Pacific, and the final amphibious operation, Okinawa, my father was there, began to occur as well. And that continued.
We have another question. Is what role did the V2 threat have with this operation? Any?
That's a very good question. And not this operation so much, but it did, the V1 and the V2 sites did influence strategy in that the British were sustaining some rather severe assaults, and the city of Antwerp received some heavy bombardments. Some of the troops during the Ardennes refer to seeing what they call buzz bombs going over and landing in their general vicinity. So part of the emphasis in the north lay with the desire to overrun the German launching sites, V1, but increasingly the V2 sites.
That's it, Brooks. That's for questions. Any other questions? Going once? Going twice? Okay. Thank you again. Thanks, Brooks, for participating and being our initial speaker, and we hope to have you back here in the near term.
All right.
There was one question that he asked is, would you like to see some of the discussions on the tail end of the war, the last several weeks during April, during the final Allied advance? And if there is, please let me know, and I'll arrange for another conversation with Brooks. Brooks, you have anything?
No, I just thank you, everybody, for taking the time to attend and listen. Remember the veterans.
Thank you. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Okay.